So, yes, please join me. The last but not least world we are talking about today is the US world. Europe's strategy redux in a post-election landscape. Stephen, please. Hi, nice to meet you. You will be in the middle, and hello once again at the end. Please, in the, yeah. Okay, so the last 30 minutes, if we may. Thank you for your ongoing support to this program and to this agenda, which is really back-to-back today. But for the last panel of this program, we have a very important topic, which is US world, Europe's strategy redux in a post-election landscape. And we also have excellent speakers on this panel. Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. Welcome, hello. Rachel TAUSENDFREUND, Senior Research Fellow at the German Council of Foreign Relations. Welcome. And Klaus, Academic Council Chairman at the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies. Hello and welcome. Now, as the US approaches a critical election, we have been talking about it throughout the program, the global balance of power is shifting, and especially for Europe, which now faces the challenge of balancing its strategic autonomy with continued dependence on US defense commitments. Now, in this panel, we will explore how US post-election policy could possibly reshape transatlantic ties and what strategic moves Europe must consider whether or not Donald Trump wins the elections. It's not all about him. Some of the responsibility is on Europe also. Now, is it okay if we use first names? Yes. Stephen, as the US possibly turns inward after this election, what does this mean for Europe?
Well, first of all, Jasmina, thank you and your colleagues for your hard work today. It's exhausting.
We have energy for one more.
Yes, well, that's great. So thank you. I don't think America's turning inward. That's the first thing. Doesn't matter. I mean, we have interests all over the world, we have corporations all over the world, we have troops all over the world. That's not going to happen. But what the US is doing, and it will happen in a bipartisan way, it is moving outward. It's moving more toward Asia than toward Europe. I mean, don't forget, it was Obama who had actually pulled a whole tank brigade out of Europe. Trump put it back in after 2014. The Americans would love Europe to step up. Yep. Robert Gates has been talking, I covered him in Brussels, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, talking about the same thing, Europe should step up. Has Europe stepped up? Not really, to be honest. Yeah, it's spending a little more. You can say now, as Stoltenberg keeps saying, 23 of 32 spend 2%, but a third do not. Yeah. And 2% isn't enough anyway, and 2% is duplicative. I mean, people are spending the money on the same things. I mean, Europe sent 10 different kinds of howitzers to Ukraine, all of them supposedly using 155 millimeter artillery shells, but they don't all fit the same things. Now, Europe should have more than one howitzer. Consolidation is dangerous, but it should be a little more efficient. And also, as the US turns toward other things, it's not leaving Europe. It's not going to close the nuclear umbrella. And it will, I think, continue to support Ukraine, but not to $61 billion a year. I think those days are over. And Europe has to do, I think it'll take a decade if Europe is serious. And you know, they talk about strategic enablers, which we can talk about, the things that the US only provides NATO that Europe does not. Yeah. And those are important and expensive things, ranging from sophisticated integrated air missile defenses to air refueling, to big transport planes, to satellite, to intelligence. There's just a lot Europe can do if it wants to get its act together. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, is this, at this moment, the Europe building itself in this security and manner, is it a matter of too little, too late kind of deal? Because you mentioned the snooze button earlier in the panels. We mentioned this snooze button. Have we overslept? I mean, we, Europe.
Well, I think we've all overslept a bit. I mean, you know, Russia is different.
Yeah.
I mean, Putin might not have done this 10 years ago. I mean, I was very struck on Ukraine because my Russian friends all said, Putin's not stupid, he won't do this, but if he does it, Ukraine will fight. My American and British friend says he's going to do it, but Ukraine will collapse in a day. And my French and German friends didn't even want to hear about it. So I think we've all kind of learned something, but we are in a generational struggle now. And I do feel, much as our Estonian colleague just said, that the farther you get away from the front, the more the snooze button works. I mean, I think there's still a lot of Germans who think you can go back to where you were before February 2022. I think that's a big mistake, and I think even German leaders know this. But Ukraine, you know, represents a serious question about how long, how much, right? And when people say, oh, well, Russia must be defeated, they don't really explain what that means. And they say Ukraine must win. It's not really clear what that means. And the Germans like to say, well, Ukraine mustn't lose and Russia mustn't win, which in a way is a recipe for a ceasefire and a stalemate and negotiations, which I think most Europeans in their heart of hearts kind of want, but may not be the right response to a Russia that is deliberately seeing this war as a defensive war, a war started by NATO, which is the way Russians think about it, and a Russia that's militarizing its economy.
You opened up a lot of questions. We will touch on some of them later. Rachel, Europe, we are all well aware, remains deeply reliant on US support for its security in this moment in time. But let's look at it from another perspective. How important it is for the US to maintain strong ties to NATO? Is it?
Sure, it's important. Also for the United States. I mean, the funny thing is, if you do public opinion surveys, it still is the case that if you ask Americans and Europeans, you know, how important is NATO for your security? More Americans will say NATO is important for their security than will Germans, for example, which is frankly nonsense. But that just goes to show you it's still the case that Americans have this idea that NATO is quite important to them. And we haven't, you know, the previous panel didn't mention politics, but actually politics are a big part of this and are an important part of this, because most of the countries we're talking about are democracies and it's not getting easier. And in the US is one of those countries where these things aren't getting easier. I mean, I agree with Stephen, the US isn't withdrawing from the world, but it is getting harder to make the case to the American public that we need to be as much in the world as we have been, and we need to spend that much. And NATO is part of that. So the US definitely on a public level, on a military level, on a political level, is deeply engaged with NATO, finds NATO still to be very important, but also on a political level, on a public level, and even on a military level, thinks the US cannot be the dominant player in NATO to the extent that it has been. And something has to change.
How vulnerable is the alliance with this mindset and with this difficulty to explain to the American public that this is the case?
I mean, for the American side of it, you know, I'm not sure. It's reasonably vulnerable, right? We all know what Trump has said about NATO, but I think it's bigger than that, right? Deterrence in the end, it's a mindset thing. It's like stock prices, right? Company is only worth something if everybody believes it's worth something. It's the same with Article 5. You know, Article 5 is only worth what everyone believes it means. And you know, lots of people are talking about Trump undermining Article 5, but what we're forgetting in that is the reason it's so important that Trump is undermining Article 5 or undermining the deterrence capability of NATO is that Europeans have been undermining the deterrence capability of NATO, well, since 1990, essentially. And therefore, we really run the risk, unless Europeans are able to strengthen that European pillar of NATO that was talked about in the last session, of it beginning to look more like a sham, you know, like WeWork or something. I don't know if anyone caught that reference. It's a good show, by the way. And so, I mean, it's something I think we really have to take seriously, and Europeans need to understand that it's not just Trump.
Yeah. Now, Klaus, talking about Europe, how far has it come really in terms of building its own defense capabilities?
I'm a firm believer that if we want to do this, we can only do this efficiently with the European Union. Mm-hmm. We cannot have 27 national defense markets. We cannot have 27 separate research programs. We cannot have 170 weapon systems when the Americans have 30. So there's always the discussion, do we have to spend more money? But first we have to spend it more efficiently. And the current estimate is that the waste rate, because we are not doing it together in the European Union, is about 30%. So let's address that issue first. And we've made a good start. There's now a defense commissioner of the European Union designated, and it's Andrius Kubilius, twice Prime Minister of Lithuania. Sitting where he is sitting in Lithuania, he has a very clear idea of the importance of his job. And he knows what he's talking about because he had the highest responsibility. And I think he came up already, without having been confirmed yet, with one very good proposal, which is to say, why don't we do in the European Union what we did with gas storage? Because we decided that now the member states have to keep gas storage when they go into winter 90% full. Mm-hmm. Why don't we do the same thing for ammunition? If we were to have a common rule that ammunition has to be 90% there, with a certain delay, of course, now for production, then the market will be there, because those who produce it know there's a market and there's a necessity to buy it. So I think we are going here in the right direction. He has to present within the first 100 days a white book on defense. There are all the strategic issues he has to put in. And I'm representing here the Martens Center, which is the political foundation of the EPP. We've just published a 100-page document which I've coordinated on how to come to a European defense in 10 steps. And that's something we would like to fit in, and we are fitting it into the debate about the White Book. So what should concretely be done? And there are many things where the EU is absolutely complementary to NATO. For example, building up production capacity. For example, military mobility. It's not good enough, and somebody said it in the last round, if the capacity is there, but it's stuck in Spain or in France. We need to get it to the Baltics and in good time. And that means bridges and roads and harbor infrastructure. It means building our own EU DARPA, because the Americans are complaining, and correctly so, that if we were to have to fight a war together, there's high tech on one side, but is it still compatible with what we have? Mm-hmm. So the European Union has a huge research fund, and that's going to be relaunched in debates next year with the multi-annual financial framework. And there the European Union can do a lot to put the money on the table if this is really our priority.
Now, it all has to do with putting our minds in one place and then going in one decisive direction. But during these panels, previous panels, we spoke about EU not having one voice. You already mentioned it's having multiple voices, even when it comes to not just the Middle East, when it comes to Ukraine and the way the war is supposed to finish. Is there a one voice or a strategy that can bring us to one conclusion that will bring us to this point of having 90% of ammunition here and you know, like just focusing more on one close strategic direction of movement?
I fully agree with you. It's a very important step that now we have one EU Commissioner for Defense. That was thought to be impossible 5 years ago. We also need one Council of Defense Ministers and a permanent standing Council of Defense Ministers. We will need not a subcommittee, but a full Committee of Defense in the European Parliament. We need to professionalize. But for the rest, let's look back to when the war started. Financial crisis, the reaction took a couple of years, I would say, until it was sufficient. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the first sanction package was passed after 2 days. We haven't done that badly.
Stephen, you wanted to?
Well, with all respect to Klaus, who I admire, I'm very worried. I don't want the European Union setting standards for how much ammunition people should have and what kinds of ammunition. That is NATO's job. And 23 EU members or members of NATO, that's NATO's job. NATO already has requirements for its member states for ammunition. What the EU needs to do, and what I hope Kubilius can do, because he doesn't have enough money to do it right now, is to actually take the money and make the orders, invest the money in research, of course, but also in getting money to defense industries in Europe with real orders so that they can produce. Because right now, I mean, I've talked to people at the European Investment Bank. They have money to lend, and they can't give it away because they offer it to the manufacturers. The manufacturers say, well, that's fine, but we need the orders. And to even order the machine tools that create the machines that make the weapons will take 5 years. So this is really, I mean, it's heading in the right direction. I agree with you. I just want, and I say this as someone who really likes the European Union and values it, you know, do your best at the things you're doing and don't get in the way of what other people are supposed to be doing.
Did you want to comment?
Yeah, that's exactly what I've said.
Okay.
That's exactly what I said.
We have a consensus.
We have to steady the demand side. And that's what Kubilius has been proposing. If there is legislation that these storages for ammunition have to be 90% full with certain deadlines, that demand will be there. It will be either paid from the European Union budget, and we have paid with the peace facility quite a lot for Ukraine, or it will be paid from national budget. But for the first time, producers would know that there is a market for what they are producing. And there the European Union can create rules which are then applicable for everybody in the Union, for all the 27 member states.
Which would be great so long as they're producing what NATO thinks its members need, rather than what Brussels thinks its members need.
Is there
Brussels
a discrepancy in this?
enough about defense.
Yeah, I think we have just found out that if we just leave it to the current procedures, ammunition stocks are empty. So it has not been enough what has been doing now. So if there were to be legislation by the European Union that ammunition stocks have to be 90% full, we would be much better positioned than we have been when this Ukraine war started.
Now, let's go to politics, which translates to society, then which translates back to defense and security, and look back on 2016, and when Trump, Stephen, won the election. It shook up Europe's political landscape. Would it be the same this time around? We see what is happening in member states of the European Union, such as Austria, with the rise of right-wing politics. How would it shape Europe?
Well, I think about this a lot. Don't forget, it was Trump who said it was you aggressive Montenegrins that was going to get us into the next world war.
Be aware.
So be aware.
Be aware.
I mean, he's very unpredictable,
Yeah.
first of all. And I think, you know, what we heard before is basically right. Trump has this obsession in his head that NATO is a dues-paying club and people aren't paying enough dues. Mark Rutte has been very good at being a Trump whisperer, even a Trump Versteher, in convincing him that actually it's Trump, not the Russian annexation of Crimea, that produced increased defense spending. And Europe is spending more, and it will spend more. So that I think that part's okay. What we don't know, and this is a thought a friend of mine had, which I think is real, Trump didn't expect to win in 2016. It was a surprise to him as well as to many people. He wasn't prepared. He had around him all kinds of people he'd first met whose job was to keep this very unpredictable guy from screwing things up. If he wins this time, and he may win this time, he will have really smart people around him who know the system, who will want to turn his instincts into policy rather than restraining him. So I think this will be different. And I should just remind people, in my country's weird electoral system, very old-fashioned, Joe Biden last time won the election by more than 7 million votes, but he really won the election by 44,000 votes in 3 or 4 key states.
Yeah.
It's going to be the same issue this time. So it really is up in the air. I just want to say this. But I do think Europe is much better prepared for another Trump. They've had time to think about it. NATO's better prepared. Finland and Sweden help a lot. And I think if just people can convince Trump that the reliance on America is less and that they back him, you know, even if rhetorically on China, I think it can be managed, inshallah.
Rachel, how can Europe not just navigate these shifts in regards to US, but plan more effectively for them in the long run?
I mean, there's a difference between planning and then actually making those plans real.
Yeah.
And that's a political problem. So it is the case that you know, now a lot of European countries think it's actually possible that Trump might win. I agree with Stephen, Trump 2 is going to be worse than Trump 1. And I think, you know, the German government definitely thinks that that's true. So people are trying to prepare and have contingency plans. But, you know, none of the answers are easy. I mean, some of the answers are easy in terms of, you know, everybody increase their spending by a tiny bit and sell it as a big victory for Trump, or these kinds of small appeasement things, that's doable. But, you know, the thing I mentioned before in terms of really doing the European part to keep NATO strong, that's going to take political will. And, you know, we've had 2 years now, and it would have been the best time for these things to manifest. I mean, a lot did happen. I don't want to say that things didn't happen, but the big things, you know, we need a lot more progress on joint procurement. We need, and we need a sort of political European thinking. Everyone spends all their time waiting for Germany, and I'm afraid the German window is closing. If you look at the last 3 election results, you had, you know, between the far right and the left-wing populist, whose sort of main thing is ending the war, you're talking about 40% of the population or more. So you now see German political leaders coming out and themselves saying, you know, we need to push for negotiations, as if this has been a thing that, you know, was possible and we were just resisting. I mean, the West was just resisting. And so it's an election year next year, and I'm worried that the small window that was opened by Germans realizing defense and security is an actual thing that you need in the world, which you know, they realized February 2022 for the most part, is now again politically going to be difficult. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think there needs to be some kind of real defense European integration step in accordance with NATO. It has to be understood that this is sort of making Europe within NATO stronger, but I think there has to be something very quickly written down that's believable. And I think the question of Ukraine, NATO membership and Ukrainian EU membership is also part of what makes that possible, part of what makes a political will possible. I don't know how, but that's what needs to happen.
Klaus, this military defense we are talking about is only part of the whole equation. What about economic resilience? What about technological sovereignty? What about the energy security? How does all this play into this picture?
Yeah, maybe a quick remark still on Germany. The window of the current government is also closing.
Yeah.
And that's maybe positive news in this sense, because if you have a Friedrich Merz-led government as of next autumn, I think they will take Ukraine extremely seriously. Yeah. But what we need is, as you said, integrated defense in Europe. So, for example, the air shield, the European air shield, that could be a basis for a kind of next generation EU2 program where we are financing it together, because all the national member states have difficulties. But that's a debate that needs to be properly prepared. On economic resilience, I remember the attack of Putin on Ukraine. Everybody was saying, look, Europe won't resist, the winter will be cold, we don't have gas, we don't get through it, and we got through it. And we continue to have energy. Yes, it was expensive, but we basically decoupled now from Russia's energy resources. And that's a huge success, including for the governments who did it, including the German government, I would say, which did that transition in a remarkable time. And suddenly planning procedures could be simplified where before we had thought it was not. So I think economic resilience we have shown, but technology we will need to build up. And that's why I mentioned we need an EU DARPA. We need to build up our own technological base. Yes, we also need the simple things like ammunition, but we need to attack on both sides.
Do we have any questions from the audience? We are nearing the end of this panel, so if you want to raise your hand, it would be now. No? Okay, and just last question maybe for everyone. Are Europe and the US drifting apart? Is that the end game, to drift apart, or are they just interconnected without the possibility of this breaking? Is this just another security cycle of things in the world?
These things go in cycles. I mean, we actually were kind of drifting apart, and then we came back together, and now we wonder a bit, right? I mean, I think more and more people realize, given the demographic changes in the world and the power changes in Brazil and China and the BRICS and blah, 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 that, you know, we are actually a very special alliance, and it's not just military, it's rule of law, it's freedom of the press, it's individual rights. And those things matter, actually, and they matter a lot. And I think they matter to Americans that we have European friends and allies who not only agree with those things, but are willing to fight for them. So I don't really worry too much about it, to be honest, but what would help a lot, and Klaus is talking rightly about this, is for Americans to see that Europeans are doing more for their own defense. I think this would make a tremendous amount of difference. I think I would just leave it at that. I'm not all that worried about the drifting apart. I mean, sometimes attention spans move and change, right?
Yeah. Rachel?
I mean, I also don't think it's a specific drifting apart. I mean, the relationship has actually always been pretty difficult. We tend to, look at the past decades as if they were great, but Obama and Merkel, who ended up having a very strong relationship, spent the first years of the financial crisis, arguing pretty heatedly with each other. I think the problem isn't that the transatlantic alliance is drifting apart. I think the problem is that it's getting more constrained in its abilities, and I think the problem for Europeans is that Europe is no longer the center of the world, also not for Americans.
What do you mean? This is news for us.
And so
it's the Western Balkans, that's the center of the world.
And so I think the transatlantic relationship will continue to be strong if Europeans are able to look also elsewhere in the world together with Americans, and that's what they're going to have to be able to do while also doing what they need to do at home. So I think that's more the challenge.
Klaus, your thoughts?
Yes. American geopolitics has always three priorities. Control the Atlantic, control the Pacific, and nobody else should control Eurasia. Control the Atlantic is fine, but they are challenged both in the Pacific and in Eurasia by China. So America will focus on China. So the precondition for keeping that alliance healthy is that Europeans take key responsibility for the conventional defense on the European continent. And I think that's what we need to do. And if we do that, I think that alliance will still last for a very long time.
We have our homework set up for us, I think. Thank you so much for being a part of this last panel of 2BS Forum here in Montenegro in this year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jasmina.